The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet only a lake can give, where the air holds a damp chill and every sound seems to echo off the still water. Frank had driven out to check on his place, the house by the lake he had built with his own hands more than 30 years ago. He wanted to fix a loose shutter, maybe clear the path of fallen branches before autumn truly set in. But the moment he turned down the gravel driveway, his heart slammed against his chest. There, staked right into the soft earth by the mailbox, was a bright red and white sign with bold letters that read, "For sale." For a long minute he just sat behind the wheel of his truck, staring. His knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. The silence of the morning was broken only by the lapping of water against the dock and the rustle of leaves in the trees, but inside his chest a storm had begun. This was his house, his lake, his work. Every board in that cabin carried sweat from his brow and memories of his late wife. He could still see her rocking on the porch swing with a glass of iced tea, could still hear her laughter when he slipped off the dock one summer day. And now, without a word, someone had the audacity to put it up for sale. His son. Frank already knew before the thought was complete. He had given Michael the keys, told him he could live there while he got back on his feet. No rent, no demands, just a father trying to help a son who had never seemed to settle. Frank had imagined his boy fishing off the dock, grilling burgers on the porch, maybe finally taking life seriously. Instead, Michael was trying to cash in on something he never earned. Frank stepped out of the truck slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. The sign swayed slightly in the breeze as if mocking him. He wanted to rip it out right then and snap it in half, but instead he walked up the path to the porch. There were voices inside. Through the open windows he could hear laughter and footsteps, the unfamiliar tones of strangers echoing through his living room. His living room. He froze on the steps and pressed a hand against the wooden railing. It felt wrong, like someone had broken into a sacred place. Peering inside, Frank caught sight of two people walking around with papers in hand, pointing at the fireplace, nodding at the vaulted ceiling beams he had cut himself. A woman said something about good bones, and a man murmured about the view adding at least another 100,000. Frank's stomach twisted. They were discussing the price of his memories as if they were trading cattle. And there, standing tall with his chest puffed out, was Michael. His son, showing off what wasn't his to give, guiding these people as if he were the rightful owner. Frank's throat tightened. He could barely breathe, let alone speak. He took a step back onto the porch and steadied himself. Anger was there, sharp and hot, but underneath it sat something heavier, betrayal, disappointment so deep it felt like a stone pressing down on his chest. He had worked every day of his life, never asking for much, never expecting luxury. The lake house was the one place where he allowed himself to feel proud. And now the boy he had raised was tossing it onto the market like a used car. He thought about the sacrifices, the years of overtime shifts, the winters when he chopped wood to keep his family warm, the endless repairs to keep the roof from leaking. He thought about his wife, about how much she had loved the water, how she whispered once that she wanted her ashes scattered across the lake. Frank had promised her he would protect this place. Now he stood on the edge of losing it, not to strangers, not to bad luck, but to his own flesh and blood. One of the potential buyers glanced through the window and noticed him on the porch. She smiled politely and waved, assuming he was some caretaker or neighbor. That burned more than anything. He was invisible in his own home. Michael barely turned his head, just muttered something to the buyers and kept talking about square footage. It was as if Frank were a ghost, already erased from the picture. Frank finally moved, stepping off the porch and walking back toward his truck. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, his fists clenched so hard his nails bit into his palms. He wanted to storm inside and shout, to throw everyone out and reclaim what was his. But another voice inside him whispered that shouting wouldn't fix this. His son had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, and this wasn't going to be solved with a simple argument. Frank would need to be careful. He would need to be smart. And above all, he would need to remember that the house, no matter what sign stood in the yard, was still his. As he drove away, the red and white letters burned in his mind. For sale. The sign stood like a challenge, daring him to act. He gripped the wheel tighter and stared down the long stretch of road. For the first time in years, he felt something awaken inside him. Not the weary patience of an aging man, but the resolve of someone who had built his life board by board and wasn't about to let it be stolen. The lake house was his legacy, his promise, his blood. And the fight for it had just begun. Frank spent the rest of that day driving without purpose, circling through small towns and back roads, the lake house never leaving his thoughts. He stopped once for coffee at a roadside diner, but the bitterness of it only sharpened the taste of betrayal already lodged in his mouth. He kept seeing Michael's face in the window, confident and proud as though the house belonged to him. It was not just arrogance, it was theft dressed up as entitlement. Frank knew his son had always been restless, but he had never expected him to take something that was never his to give away. By evening, Frank finally returned to his own modest home in town. The kitchen smelled faintly of dust and old wood, a scent that reminded him of his wife's absence more than anything else. He dropped his keys on the counter and sat down heavily, staring at the faded linoleum. For the first time he allowed the weight of what he had seen to sink in. The house by the lake had been more than just a property. It was a chapter of his life, a monument to endurance. Now it was being priced, measured, and marketed like a piece of inventory by the very son he had hoped to help. He tried to understand Michael's motives. Debt perhaps. He had heard rumors from neighbors that Michael had fallen behind on credit cards, that his wife, Carol, pushed him to chase easy money. She had never liked the lake house. Too rustic, too far from the city. Carol liked the idea of cash in hand, the promise of quick deals. Frank could almost hear her voice urging Michael, telling him they could finally start fresh if he sold the place. It stung more because he had always suspected she saw him as an obstacle, an old man holding on to things she thought outdated. Days passed and Frank did not go back immediately. He needed space to think. But each morning he woke up with the same tight knot in his chest. By the third day he decided he had to see for himself what was happening. He drove back to the lake road, this time stopping before turning down the driveway. From his truck, hidden by a line of trees, he watched. The sign still stood, gleaming red and white in the afternoon sun. A different car was parked outside. He saw strangers walking up the steps, heard faint echoes of laughter, the sound of feet crossing his porch. Michael was leading another tour. Frank's jaw clenched as he observed. These people were smiling, nodding, pointing toward the dock as if already imagining themselves owning it. They did not know the history written into those walls, the winters survived, the summers filled with family barbecues. They only saw a property with potential. And his son fed their vision, waving his hands, painting pictures of futures that erased Frank entirely. The betrayal hardened in Frank's stomach into something else, something colder. That evening, Frank pulled down a metal box from the closet in his home. It was dusty, heavy, and filled with documents he had kept for decades, tax forms, insurance papers, and most importantly, deeds. He laid them out on the table under the warm glow of a single lamp. His fingers traced the ink of his name, his late wife's name, the signatures that confirmed ownership. Nowhere was Michael's name. He had given permission to live there, not to sell, and certainly not to claim it as his own. Seeing the proof steadied Frank like cold water on a burn. Still he was torn. He was a father. Confronting his son felt like declaring war on family, and part of him clung to hope that Michael would come to his senses. Yet the sight of strangers wandering through the house replayed in his mind, and he knew waiting would mean losing everything. Carol's influence was strong and Michael's weakness even stronger. Frank understood now that hesitation was dangerous. 2 days later, Frank decided to test his son, to give him a chance to speak the truth. He drove to the lake in the late afternoon, when he knew Michael would be around. He parked, walked past the sign and stepped onto the porch. The air was heavy with the smell of grilled meat. Through the screen door he could see Michael and Carol at the kitchen table, eating and laughing as if they owned the place outright. When Michael noticed him, his expression shifted only slightly, irritation flickering across his face before he masked it with forced cheer. "Dad," he said, rising slowly, "I didn't expect you." Carol barely looked up, her eyes narrowing in quiet disapproval. Frank stood in the doorway, his hands at his sides, and asked in a steady voice what the sign meant. Michael chuckled, shrugged, and said it was nothing serious, just exploring options, just testing the market. But Frank caught the glint in his son's eyes, the quick glance exchanged with Carol, and he knew it was a lie. His heart sank. He had wanted honesty, maybe even apology, but what he got was deception wrapped in charm. He did not argue. He simply nodded, excused himself, and walked back into the fading light. Behind him, he heard Carol whisper something sharp, followed by Michael's low reply. It no longer mattered what was said. What mattered was that Frank finally understood there would be no turning back. That night he returned to the metal box and pulled out the deed again. His fingers brushed across the embossed seal, the document that proved the lake house was his and his alone. He sat for hours, staring at it, hearing the echo of his wife's laughter on the porch, seeing the red for sale sign planted like a blade in his memories. The betrayal had grown too large to ignore, too poisonous to forgive without action. By the time dawn broke, Frank's decision was made. He folded the deed carefully, slid it into a thick envelope, and placed it inside his worn leather briefcase. The next step would not be shouting, nor pleading, nor another wasted conversation. The next step would be strategy. And as he zipped the briefcase shut, he felt a shift inside himself, a slow hardening of resolve. His son thought he had control, but Frank knew the truth. The house was still his and the fight was just beginning. Frank did not sleep much after that night. The envelope with the deed sat on the kitchen table like a silent reminder of everything at stake. He had folded and refolded so many times the edges had softened, the paper warm from his touch. When the sun came up, he carried the briefcase to his truck, slid it behind the passenger seat and started the engine. He did not drive toward the lake this time. Instead, he headed into town, toward a small office with a brass plaque on the door that read Miller and Associates. Sam Miller had been his friend for more than 40 years. They had worked side by side in the factory before Sam had gone to law school on the GI Bill. Now Sam was one of the few people Frank trusted completely. When Frank stepped into the office, Sam looked up from his cluttered desk, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. His eyes narrowed as he saw the tightness in Frank's jaw. Without a word, Frank placed the envelope on the desk and sat down heavily in the chair opposite. Sam opened it, scanned the papers and leaned back with a low whistle. "Your son thinks he can sell this place?" he asked. Frank nodded once, his lips pressed into a hard line. He did not want to speak too much. The words would only crack under the weight of emotion. Sam tapped the deed with a finger and said slowly that Michael had no legal ground. The house was Frank's. At best, Michael was a tenant, and tenants did not sell property they did not own. The law was clear. Hearing it should have been comforting, but instead it filled Frank with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the house was safe for now, sorrow that it had come to this. Sam leaned forward, his voice calm but firm, and told Frank that the smart move was to gather every piece of paperwork, to make sure no loophole could be exploited. He promised to prepare documents that would end this nonsense quickly. Frank listened, nodded, and left the office with the briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. That afternoon, Frank drove back to the lake, not to confront but to watch. He parked down the road and waited. Within an hour, a sleek SUV pulled up. Out stepped Michael and Carol, dressed as if they were heading to a business meeting. They were met by a man in a suit, clearly a real estate agent. Frank watched them gesture toward the house, saw the agent jot notes on a clipboard. The three of them stood on the porch, laughing, pointing, imagining commission and profit. From the distance, Frank felt like an intruder in his own life. He stayed hidden, letting the scene etch itself into his memory. The agent drove away after an hour, leaving Michael and Carol alone on the porch. Frank watched his son light a cigarette, something he had picked up only recently, a nervous habit. Carol leaned against the railing, her phone glued to her ear, pacing back and forth. They looked less like a couple building a future and more like gamblers on the edge of a table, betting with chips that were not theirs. When Frank returned home that evening, he found himself pacing the kitchen floor. The image of strangers in suits discussing his house haunted him. He replayed the conversation with Sam, clinging to the lawyer's steady confidence. Yet doubt gnawed at him. Michael had a talent for making bad choices look convincing. He could charm, bluff, and push until people gave in. Frank feared the buyers might act before the truth could catch up. The next day confirmed his worries. A neighbor called to say she had seen several cars parked at the house, with people walking around inside. Frank's stomach twisted. The showings were becoming frequent, as if Michael had already lined up serious buyers. That evening he drove out again, this time standing at the edge of the trees as dusk settled in. Through the windows he could see lights blazing, hear voices drifting across the water. Michael was hosting yet another group, raising glasses in what looked like a toast. The casual disrespect of it made Frank's blood run hot. Yet he did not march inside. Instead he went home and opened the metal box once more, carefully organizing every paper. Property tax receipts, insurance renewals, maintenance bills, every scrap that bore his name. The table was covered in proof, a fortress of ink and signatures. Sam was right. The law was on his side. But the law took time and Frank knew time was slipping away. For the first time, a flicker of fear entered his mind. What if Michael found a buyer willing to pay cash under the table? What if papers were forged, signatures faked? Frank tried to push the thoughts away, but they gnawed at him through the night. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by images of the house emptied, the porch swing gone, the dock abandoned to strangers. On the third morning Sam called. His voice was brisk, professional. He said he had drafted letters and filings that would make it clear the property could not be sold. He asked Frank to come in and sign them. Frank drove to the office with steady hands, his heart thudding. Sam slid a stack of papers across the desk, explaining each one, his voice calm. Frank signed carefully, each stroke of the pen anchoring his claim deeper into the law. When he finished, Sam leaned back and gave him a long look. "This isn't just about a house," he said quietly. "It's about your son showing his true colors. Are you ready for that?" Frank met his eyes. He did not speak, but the silence was answer enough. He folded the signed papers, placed them back into the briefcase and left the office. That evening, Frank sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The lake house shimmered in his memory the way it looked years ago, filled with laughter, alive with family. Now it stood at the center of a battle he had never imagined fighting. He knew Michael would not give up easily. The lies would deepen, the games would grow dirtier. But Frank had taken his first step. He had armed himself with truth, with proof, and with resolve. The road ahead promised conflict, but the thought no longer made him weak. Instead, it made him sharper, ready. Frank woke the next morning with a heaviness in his chest, but it was not the same kind of helpless weight he had felt earlier in the week. This was different. It was resolve. The papers were signed, the legal boundaries set, and now the fight had moved from his imagination into the real world. He knew Michael would not simply back down. His son had always pushed until someone pushed back harder. And now it was time. By late afternoon, Frank drove out toward the lake again. The autumn air was brisk, leaves scattering across the gravel road, the kind of day that would normally bring peace to his heart. But as he turned into the driveway, he saw more cars than before lined up near the house. He parked quietly at the edge and walked closer, his boots sinking into damp ground. Through the windows he could see a crowd, potential buyers gathered inside, glasses of wine in their hands, talking in excited tones. The living room where his wife's voice once filled the air was now echoing with chatter about investment potential. Michael was in his element. He moved around the group with the confidence of a salesman, gesturing toward the stone fireplace, bragging about the view, promising that the dock would be perfect for summer parties. Carol stood near the back, her smile wide, her eyes calculating. She poured drinks, nodded along, feeding the illusion of ownership. Frank stayed outside in the shadows, watching, his fists clenching and unclenching. He thought of storming in, shouting the truth, scattering these people like startled birds. But Sam's advice echoed in his mind: patience, timing, precision. When the group finally left, Frank waited until the last car rolled away before stepping onto the porch. The screen door creaked open. Michael was collecting empty glasses and Carol was wiping the counter. Their faces shifted when they saw him. His son stiffening, his daughter-in-law narrowing her eyes. Frank said little, only that he knew what was happening. Michael muttered something about just business and thinking of the future, but Frank cut him off with a look. He left soon after, his silence heavier than any words he could have thrown. The following day Michael made his move. A notice arrived at Frank's mailbox, an official-looking paper declaring intent to sell with Michael's name scrawled across the bottom. Frank sat at the kitchen table, reading it under the lamp's yellow light, his jaw tightening. It was bluff and bravado, nothing legally binding, but it showed how far his son was willing to go. The boy he had once carried on his shoulders now stood as an adversary, willing to gamble away the very roof his family had built together. Frank wasted no time. He drove straight to Sam's office, laid the paper on the desk, and watched as his old friend shook his head with a humorless smile. "He thinks this will scare you," Sam said. "But he's only digging his own hole." Together they drafted a cease and desist, a letter stamped with authority, clear enough to shatter any illusion of Michael's power. Sam promised to file motions that would stop any sale attempt cold. Frank felt something shift in his chest, an ember of satisfaction glowing beneath the ashes of betrayal. Yet the conflict grew dirtier. Within a week, whispers reached him from neighbors. Michael had been telling people that Frank was senile, unfit to manage property, that the lake house needed new hands before it crumbled. The word spread like poison, turning sympathy into doubt. Frank could feel it when he walked into the grocery store, the way people looked at him, pity mixed with suspicion. It stung worse than the legal battle. It was his own son using character as a weapon. One evening, Frank stood at the edge of the lake, the wind cutting cold across the water. He remembered building the dock board by board, his wife standing nearby, handing him nails, their son running barefoot in the grass. He wondered how those memories had soured into this battlefield. But as the water shimmered in the fading light, he found his answer. The house was not just wood and stone. It was a promise, a life's work, a legacy. To give it up would be to give up everything he stood for. The next confrontation came sooner than expected. Michael arrived at Frank's home unannounced, his face flushed with anger. He accused his father of meddling, of ruining deals, of standing in the way of progress. Frank listened in silence, the weight of decades pressing down on him. When Michael finally paused for breath, Frank spoke only a few words, steady and final. "The house isn't yours to sell." The words hung in the air like iron. Michael left without another sound, but the storm in his eyes promised the fight was not over. That night, Frank sat with the briefcase open on the table, the deed resting on top of the pile. He traced the edges once more, steadying himself. The battle had escalated beyond money. It had become a test of loyalty, of truth, of what family meant when greed stripped away its disguise. And as he closed the briefcase and slid it back under his arm, he knew the moment was coming when everything would break into the open. The court would see. The judge would hear. The red sign that had mocked him would stand for something else entirely when the truth was revealed. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and polish, the kind of place where decisions carried the weight of generations. Frank had never imagined he would sit there across from his own son, but the day had come. The benches creaked as people shifted, neighbors drawn by curiosity, strangers filling the back rows. At the front, Michael sat with Carol at his side, his suit too sharp, his posture too confident. He glanced at Frank only once, a fleeting look that carried defiance and a trace of fear. Frank sat still, his briefcase resting on his lap, his hands folded over it. He had not come for spectacle. He had come for truth. The judge entered, the room rising and then settling into silence. Papers rustled, voices hushed. The proceedings began. Michael's lawyer stood, spinning a story of an old man unable to manage property, of a son stepping in to secure a future, of intentions misread and generosity misunderstood. It was a performance crafted to twist pity into permission. Frank listened without moving, his jaw clenched, his breath steady. He had heard enough lies in recent weeks to last a lifetime. When it was Frank's turn, Sam rose. His voice was measured, calm, carrying the authority of both law and friendship. He laid out the facts with precision. The deed in Frank's name, the taxes paid year after year, the permissions granted to Michael that never once included the right to sell. He spoke of the attempts to deceive buyers, the slander whispered through town, the false documents mailed in arrogance. And then, with deliberate care, he opened the briefcase and withdrew the envelope. He held up the deed, its embossed seal glinting under the courtroom lights, and placed it gently before the judge. A murmur rippled through the room. The contrast was stark, a son's bluster against a father's patient truth. The judge adjusted his glasses, studied the papers and nodded slowly. He asked a few brief questions, each one answered firmly by Sam, each answer hammering the coffin of Michael's case shut. Carol shifted in her seat, her face paling. Michael's shoulders stiffened, but his confidence began to crack. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently, but the man only shook his head. Frank sat in silence through it all, his eyes fixed on the table before him. He thought of his wife, of her laughter echoing off the water, of her wish that the lake house remain a place of family. He thought of the red sign planted like a wound in the earth. And he thought of the boy he had carried on his shoulders, now a grown man lost to greed. The ache was deep, but beneath it was steel. When the judge finally spoke, his voice cut through the air with the clarity of finality. The property was and would remain Frank's alone. Any attempt to sell it by another was void, without legal standing. Further, slanderous claims of incompetence were dismissed as unfounded. The decision was firm, unshakable. Michael's head dropped slightly, the weight of defeat settling across him. Carol looked away, her lips pressed thin. The gavel struck and just like that, it was over. But the sound echoed in Frank's chest longer than in the room. He rose slowly, gathered the deed, and placed it carefully back into the envelope. As he walked out of the courthouse, the crowd parted in silence. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered, but Frank did not look back. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, the sun glinting off parked cars, the trees shedding gold across the pavement. Frank paused at the steps, the envelope tucked securely under his arm. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders loosened, his breath came steady. The house was safe. The legacy was intact. The promise to his wife had been kept. Yet victory carried no joy. There was no triumph in watching his son fall, only a hollow ache where pride should have been. He had defended his home, but the cost was measured in blood ties frayed beyond repair. As he reached his truck, he glanced back once at the courthouse door, half hoping to see Michael step out, to hear some word of remorse. But the door remained closed and the silence was answer enough. That evening Frank drove out to the lake. The red sign still stood in the yard, tilting slightly in the wind. He pulled it from the ground with steady hands, carried it to the dock and dropped it into the water. The ripples spread outward, carrying the letters away until they vanished beneath the surface. He stood there for a long time, the sky streaked with pink and gold, the lake calm and endless. He sat on the porch swing, the wood creaking beneath him, and let the memories wash over. His wife's laughter, his son's footsteps, summers filled with warmth, winters of endurance. All of it alive within the walls, unshaken by deceit. The house was more than shelter. It was history, promise, blood, and bone. And now it was his again, secured not just by paper but by resolve. As night settled, Frank lit a small lamp and watched its glow spill across the boards of the porch. The world beyond was uncertain, but here, for now, there was peace. He whispered a quiet thank you to the still water, to the trees, to the memory of his wife. The fight was finished, but the lesson remained. Love could be tested, trust could be broken, but truth endured. And as long as the lake reflected the sky, the house would stand as proof that some things cannot be sold. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.